I come to this Assembly as Australia has each year since the first General Assembly in 1946, and I come in the same spirit to seek solutions to the great challenges of our age and together help give those solutions effect. Just on a year ago, just down the road from here, a destructive chain of events triggered the worst global financial crisis in 3/4 of a century. And it was just on a year ago that I addressed this Assembly for the first time, 10 days after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, to reflect on the challenges which lay ahead for the proper regulation of global financial markets. That reform program is now underway through the G20, the Financial Stability Board and the IMF. But there remains much work to be done. To prevent the unrestrained greed of unregulated financial markets that has wrought such economic carnage across the world these last 12 months, from sowing the seeds of future financial crises. Mr. President, the global financial crisis has been a wake-up call to the international community to reform the institutions of global governance, and a wake-up call that our system of global governance today is in radical need of reform. Because the truth is that the failure of these institutions is not just a matter of concern for governments and for diplomats and for economists. The price of failure of these institutions has been paid by working people and their families right across the world. The events on Wall Street spread rapidly and indiscriminately to every corner of the globe, from London to Lima, from Beijing to Barcelona, from Melbourne to Mumbai. Developed and developing economies. This global financial crisis and its ensuing economic and employment crisis has been no respecter of national boundaries and no respecter of peoples. Australia has been no exception. The global financial crisis saw the Australian stock market fall by 55%, wiped around $150 billion from the retirement savings of Australian workers, and has led to tens of thousands of Australians losing their jobs. And we expect more job losses to follow. Behind each of these statistics lie the faces of working Australians who have seen their savings diminish, their financial security eroded, and their job security threatened. Like Liverpool in Sydney, where the decline in its light manufacturing base has led to an increase in unemployment of 4.5% over the past year, and now 19,000 local people are without work in that area. Like the tourist destination of Cairns in far north Queensland, where unemployment has risen 3.7% over the past year, meaning that 13,300 people are now out of work in that area. And like the southeastern suburbs of Perth, where unemployment has risen 3.3% in the past year, leaving 12,800 people in that community without a job as well. In communities like these across Australia, the global recession is hurting in very real ways. Just as in communities like these across the world, the global recession is hurting in very real ways. Mr. President, we can never forget these men, these women and their families as we seek to find a path out of this global recession. While our global economic system failed comprehensively to prevent this crisis, the G20 governments have rallied to reduce the damage and prevent systemic collapse. Through the agency of the G20, for the first time involving heads of government from the major developed and developing economies, governments acted in concert to provide around $13.6 trillion worth of support to directly stabilise the global financial system. But the truth is, our global economic recovery is far from certain, and many twists and turns lie ahead. Furthermore, the institutions of global economic governance are facing new challenges. First, the financial market reform program must be completed and implemented to prevent a future crisis. Second, in anticipation of global economic recovery, we must agree on a framework for the coordinated withdrawal of our emergency interventions. And third, and most critically, we must articulate a new framework for sustainable future economic growth. a framework that doesn't simply return to business as usual, based on unsustainable financial imbalances, excessive consumption, fuelled by consumer and corporate debt, and irresponsible risk-taking in systemically significant financial institutions. One of the failures of the old growth model of the last decade was the lack of effective global economic coordination. This allowed imbalances to grow unchecked and financial institutions to remain inadequately supervised. As we move towards recovery, we must build a framework to foster both growth and balance in the global economy. In Pittsburgh, we have an historic opportunity to agree on a framework to deliver effective coordination of our national economic policies. This framework should have 4 key elements. First, G20 members should agree on a common objective to achieve balanced and sustainable growth. Second, G20 members should outline their own national economic strategy and identify how it contributes to our common objectives. Third, the IMF should analyse the individual national economic plans to determine whether they are consistent and collectively adequate to achieve sustainable and balanced global growth. And fourth, these reports should be submitted to the G20 to form the basis of peer review, which would identify specific risks and vulnerabilities for the future. The other great global challenge of our age is climate change. With only 74 days remaining until Copenhagen, the governments of the world are far from agreement. Enough has been said on the need for action on climate change. But as of today, not enough action has been taken. Our collective political will to date has not been adequate to meet the task. For too long, discussions between developed and developing countries have degenerated into mutual recrimination. Developing countries accusing developed countries of failing to meet their obligations, given their undeniable responsibility for the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions already in the atmosphere. And developed countries warning the major emerging economies that unless they take action, global warming will increase to unacceptable levels based on emerging economy emissions alone. The trouble is both arguments are right. What is required globally is the leadership to embrace this truth and to respond to it accordingly. Because the truth is, all our governments need to reach beyond their self-interests and instead fashion a grand bargain between the developed and developing countries of the world. We must make use of all available mechanisms for international cooperation, including the Major Economies Forum and the G20, to achieve success in these negotiations. For us all, this will be a test of our leadership. As chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, I know that time is already running out for the island states of the Pacific. Coastal inundation is not a prospect, it is a reality. 50% of the population of these island states reside within 1.5 kilometres of the coast. The South Pacific is part of the human face of climate change. And that's why Australia nationally, regionally and globally stands ready to play its part in acting on this great moral, environmental and economic challenge of our time. One truth remains absolutely clear. The proliferation of nuclear weapons can never make any country more secure. The nuclear test by North Korea this year was rightly condemned across the international community. It reiterates that the only path to safety is through the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. Australia is encouraged by the commitment of the US and Russia to further reduce their nuclear arsenals. But the international community must also progress the broader disarmament and non-proliferation agenda. The United Nations is not a place. It is not an institution. The United Nations is us. We, the people of the United Nations, as the Charter begins. It is we who must find solutions to the problems we face, build consensus around those solutions and implement those solutions. This organisation had its beginnings not in an act of will, though will was certainly needed, but in an act of imagination, an idea of what the world should and could be. This is the challenge of leadership, to imagine a future worth having and then craft that vision into a practical and present reality. Mr. President, that was the challenge to which our forebears rose in 1945. That, Mr. President, is the challenge to which our generation must now rise for the future. I thank the Assembly.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of Australia for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency.